So I want to welcome you all to the March Children's Mental Health Matters webinar series. My name is Roni. I am the Child and Family Program Manager at MHAMD. And I'm just going to start by giving us a very brief introduction to what we're going to be learning about today. So today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you in the coming weeks. Our speaker today, Emily Moody, will explore how trauma affects the brain and body, and we'll be discussing the physiological changes that occur in response to trauma and its long-term impact on mental health. Today, you'll get to hear a deeper understanding of how trauma shapes behavior and emotional regulation, with a special focus on supporting children and families who have experienced trauma. You'll also hear practical strategies to help support healing and resilience in the face of trauma. And so as we listen to today's presentation, I want you all to think about how this information can directly support the well-being of children in your community. Think about how sharing this information in a very easy to understand way can help children better understand what they have experienced, and also how it can promote resilience in not only children, but also adults who have experienced trauma in childhood. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Emily serves as the Director of Clinical Services at For All Seasons. She has nearly 30 years of direct service experience and specializes in working with adults with complex trauma, depression, anxiety, and grief. She has received trauma training and certification from Community Connections, the Children's Guild, and most recently, the Ferentz Institute. She has provided local and regional trainings on adverse childhood experiences, mindfulness, social work ethics, vicarious trauma, and the impact of trauma on developing brains. She is an advocate for self-care and practices her own through cooking, singing, and trying to convince her husband to get a cat. And so, Emily, we just want to welcome you, and we will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the introduction. We're going to go ahead. I'm going to start screen sharing. Give me just a moment. And I'm so excited to see that so many people signed up for this. It really just makes me happy to know that other people share. There we go. So you can see my slides now. Yes. Good. Great. So it's just so exciting to see so many people signed up, to know that people are as interested in this topic as I am. Again, I'm coming to you from For All Seasons. I'm here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We are the Behavioral Health and Rape Crisis Center for the Eastern Shore, but thanks to telehealth, we actually serve clients all across the state. And, again, excited to share this because I'm really passionate about understanding the neurobiology, because it has the power to change the way that we work, not only with children, but with families and even with adults who've been impacted by trauma. And to be really clear, I'm not a neuroscientist by any stretch of the imagination. I just really, really, really like to learn about and read about and talk about brains. And it's entirely possible that I missed my calling in life, but obviously that ship sailed, so we're just going to do what we can do. But what I have found in my own practice is that there's so much power when we can understand our biology, that for my clients, when I bring this into my own practice, that to be able to reframe and say, I'm not crazy, right? My brain and body are actually behaving in a very expected way, that you're not crazy at all. It's just your brain. Let's understand it better. And it's really had incredible power in changing the work that I do, even with the adults that I work with. So thank you again for the opportunity to be able to talk. We have a lot of stuff to cover in a short period of time. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat. If I can get to them, I will. And if not, I'll make sure that I have time to answer questions either at the end or if we need to connect by email afterwards. So thank you all so much. Our agenda is really simple and straightforward. We're going to talk about what trauma is and make sure that we are all working from a shared definition. We are going to talk about how the brain responds. So we'll spend some detail on particular organs in the brain and what their sensitivities are to toxic stress. And then we're going to talk about what we can do. Because I don't know about you all, but I know for myself, I come to a lot of these trainings and we're really good at talking about the problems and identifying where the challenges are. And we're not always as great at saying, and here's what we can do. What are the strategies? Now what, right? The reality is you're probably already doing a lot. Whatever your context is, there are probably a lot of things that you're currently doing that are supporting a healing brain. But we're going to contextualize some of those things a little bit differently. So let's jump right in and talk about what is trauma. It's everywhere. I don't know about you all, but I've noticed this incredible uptick in the way that the word trauma is integrated into our culture these days. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, was actually on the New York Times bestseller list for 168 weeks. That the word is used everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's in pop culture. It's on television. It's in movies. It's in every Oprah book that I've ever read. The hashtag trauma has 6.2 billion views on TikTok. So people are talking about trauma. The challenge is, though, that many of us are not using the word in the same way. And that sometimes that word can actually get used pretty casually, right? I was stuck in trauma. I was stuck in traffic. It was such a trauma. You know, my team lost the Super Bowl. It was so traumatic. That it can be used very casually, which is not necessarily helpful for us. But there are ways in which that term is helpful in terms of increasing awareness. And so I want to make sure that we, for our time together today and for you all moving forward, that we're clear that we're not using the term in a vague way just to reflect anything that's challenging, or that we're not just talking about a general mental health struggle. We need to take it seriously. And again, purposes for our discussion, that there's a very specific set of definitions that I want us to all be familiar with and to be using. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines trauma as when a child experiences an intense event that causes or threatens or causes harm to his or her emotional and physical well-being. Our friends at SAMHSA have expanded that a little bit for adults and for kids to say that trauma occurs from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that's experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. Okay, so these are the definitions that I want for us to keep in mind as we're continuing our conversation together. There's, of course, different types of trauma. We talk about acute traumatic events. Those are the things that tend to show up in the news. So single events like a school shooting, gang violence, a sudden or violent loss of a loved one, a physical assault, a sexual assault. These are some of the things that might be considered acute traumas. They have a definitive beginning and an end. There's also more complex or chronic trauma. Sometimes you might hear that referred to as developmental trauma, because oftentimes these types of traumas happen with a primary caregiver and can impact attachment. So when we're talking about developmental trauma, that's things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, or domestic violence. These are situations that may be ongoing. And then there are also life events that can be experienced as traumatic, such as a death of a sibling or a caregiver or a parent, separation from a parent, sibling, or caretaker, things like incarceration or deportation or relocation. So sometimes things just happen in life that children can experience as a trauma. The best way to remember this is to think about the 3 E's. So what is the event itself? How does the individual experience it? And what is the lasting effect? And why this is important, a couple of things. One, the brain does not discriminate. Trauma is trauma. So there's a very specific way that the brain responds. We're going to get into it in some detail. But the other thing is that these 3 E's, they're very individual. That you can have 2 people in the same room experiencing the same thing. One of them might experience that event as traumatic and the other might not. So whether something is considered trauma depends a lot on how somebody experiences the event itself and what the lasting effects are. So let's talk about how the brain responds to trauma. So we've moved through a third of our agenda. Amazing. So How does the brain respond? Well, the first thing that you need to know is that your brain is actually very, very squishy and that it is very, very sensitive. And developing brains in particular are especially sensitive. And at certain windows of development, so different organs in our brain develop at different times in our life cycle. And because of that, they have a unique sensitivity to their environments at particular times. So that can be both positive and negative. And we're going to dig into some of those sensitivities in a little bit. But for right now, the place where I want to start is helping us to understand what happens in our brains and our bodies when we experience something that is stressful or traumatic. Because that stress response, it can help us survive, but if it's left unchecked, it can also be toxic to a developing brain. So the stress response simplified. So we're going to take all that neuroscience and we're going to make it digestible and useful for us in whatever setting you're working with kids, whether this is at school or whether it's at home or whether it's in a childcare facility or mental health or, whatever your setting is. So breaking it down, there's 3 stages to the stress response. And by the way, this is helpful for us to know for ourselves too, because we're not just talking about kids and trauma. We all experience the stress response consistently. So it also helps us to understand our own neurobiology, right? So it's a 3-stage response, and it's all driven by a part of your brain called your amygdala. And your amygdala's main job is to scan the environment for potential threats or dangers. So if a threat is perceived, your amygdala triggers the alert. It sends out the signal that the rest of your body needs to direct its energy and attention in order to prepare for its response. So what does that mean? So the stress response itself is actually your body releasing cortisol. And what that does is that cortisol triggers the other systems in your body to be ready. So this is familiar to a lot of us. This is when your heart beats faster, your muscles tense up, your breathing gets faster, you might find yourself shaking, your mouth gets dry, your bladder relaxes. These are all things that happen so that you can respond to the thing causing the threat. Okay, so your amygdala says, oh my gosh, something is wrong. Your body prepares, then sets off the stress response and releases cortisol. If it's a really big threat, so something super scary, something major, then you may get the release of adrenaline as well. And if that cortisol and adrenaline, which by the way, is the most powerful chemical combination in the human body, right? It is incredibly powerful. So if you've got cortisol and adrenaline, you are really feeling this. But what can happen is if we don't respond the way that our brain and our body want us to respond, we can actually be in distress. So that's where we start talking about toxic stress. So if we were so lucky as to have a meter in our brain to tell us where our cortisol levels were, if we're in that stress response, which most of us know as that fight, flight, or freeze, if we're in that state, we're experiencing that elevated cortisol level. Okay, so that's what it would look like. When the meter is on red, your brain and your body need you to act. They are compelling you to act. The way that the system is designed is to help you survive. And if we think about evolution and how the stress response developed over time, is that evolutionarily speaking, this is a system that was designed to work for about 20 minutes. And the reason for that being that gives you enough time to escape from a predator, to fight back, or to play dead. Okay? So your cortisol meter is high. Your brain and your body are saying, oh my gosh, we have to do something. But it has a very specific order that it wants you to do those things. So if we need to move that needle from red to green, which is what we're trying to do, the first thing that your brain wants you to do is that it wants you to solve the problem, right? It just wants you to figure out what to do so that we can be done with it. So for example, we'll talk about a low level stress. If I'm standing on the curb and I getting ready to cross the street, but I see a bus speeding out of the corner of my eye. My amygdala says, oh, I get a little bit of cortisol. I jump back on the curb and wait. I've solved the problem. My cortisol level doesn't go up super high in that scenario, but it goes back down as soon as I've solved the problem. The next thing your brain wants you to do is that it wants you to cope with the problem. So thinking about kids and maybe a situation where there's some high stakes testing or some, sort of academic pressure, that this is where coping skills come in. So I can't escape the problem. I have to take the test. I have to deal with it, right? But I can practice breathing skills and I can practice tapping and I can do some other things to help regulate myself. So I can cope with it and then I can let my cortisol meter go back down to green. If I can't do those things, then my brain wants me to escape from the problem. And if nothing else, my brain just wants me to survive. So once I can do one or more of these things, my system relaxes, my cortisol levels return to normal, and things carry on. So let's think for a moment about kids. So thinking about kids that you may know that, maybe in some challenging situations. I can think about at least a couple that I know. In particular, a kid who was growing up in a home where there was quite a bit of domestic violence, fortunately. This was a child who was exposed to threats on a daily basis. He saw his mom get hurt. He was exposed to weapons in the home. There was police activity in the home. There were fears that parents were going to be arrested or that they were going to be removed from the home. Think about a child who's growing up in a home where there's substance abuse, where the connection and care may exist sometimes and may not exist at others. So maybe there's food, maybe there's, I've got the appropriate clothing, maybe there's not. So at best, the care is inconsistent. At worst, maybe neglectful. So when we think about these things, think about the levels of cortisol that are happening in the brains and bodies for kids who may be in these situations, and think about what it is that your brain needs you to do in order to be able to move that meter back down. So how much capacity does a 5-year-old have to solve the problem if they've got a parent who is dealing with domestic violence or substance use? How well can a child cope with that? How can anyone cope with that? How do you cope with something that is so awful and so tragic? And how can you really escape? You might be able to hide in your room, but you're still going to know what's going on. You can't really leave. The best that you can hope for is just to try to survive. So this is really important for us to understand, that kids in traumatic situations, they're in situations where their brain and their body are giving them all this cortisol and probably some adrenaline too. And there's not the ability for them to biologically do the things that they're being compelled to do. So then the question becomes, what happens when that cortisol meter is too high? What happens if you can't respond or resolve the threat? The meter stays high. And when that meter remains elevated, the cortisol that helped us survive, by the way, that can become toxic to a developing brain. So let's talk about what happens to brains. There's 2 specific things that happen or that can happen. So the first one is that children impacted by chronic stress as a result of trauma, they may experience a more sensitive and or a more prolonged stress response. So they might be quicker to react and that reaction might last longer. In addition, there are specific areas of the brain which may change in size and may not function optimally. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. So stress response designed to help us survive. Toxic levels of when we can't resolve the stress, cortisol levels become toxic and can be damaging to brain structures. Which areas of the brain specifically are affected? And we're going to talk about each of these in some detail as we move through. But we're going to talk about the amygdala, which of course is the trigger for the stress response. We're going to talk about the hippocampus. We're going to talk about the corpus callosum. And of course, our prefrontal cortex, really important part of our brain. So, brains. So a little more about your amygdala. So it actually comes from the Latin word for almond. You have two of them. There's one in each hemisphere of your brain. And this is a part of your brain that's mature at birth. So remember that different organs in your brain mature at different times. And that's part of what makes these sensitivities happen, is that, particular parts of your brain are developing at a time when, if abuse occurs, there's a little more risk for damage. But your amygdala is mature when you're born. Why? Well, the reason for that is that its job is to keep you alive. And it needs to be fully developed in order to respond to stress. So even as infants, your amygdala triggers the alarm when you're hungry or wet or tired. Okay? The amygdala's job is not to think or process. Its job is to react, and to react quickly. It is also very, very, very sensitive. And it is it's sensitive to experiences of abuse really at any age, but especially sexual abuse up to the age of 5. So very early childhood experiences of abuse or trauma can really impact the amygdala. And the way that that can be impacted is that the amygdala can become larger and more active. So think about that for a second. If the amygdala's job is to be on alert and to trigger if something scary or dangerous might be happening, and you've got an amygdala that's bigger and more active, what might that look like in a school setting or in a daycare setting or even at home? What kinds of changes in behavior or emotions or language, what kind of things might you see or observe in children with an active amygdala? So one thing is that you're going to see that these are kids who will be quick to fear. And sometimes that's subjective fear. And what that means is that things that might be frightening or scary to a child who's got an overactive amygdala may not be frightening or scary to anybody else. In fact, people around that child might be saying, "What's wrong with you? Why are you freaking out over this?" The amygdala, remember, it's not a thinking organ, it's an acting organ. And so there might be more perceived fears when you have an overactive amygdala. And that fear might be more intense as well. The stress response might last longer. So when we talk about cortisol levels going down, that may take a little bit longer for somebody with an overactive amygdala. And they might kind of always present as being anxious or nervous or on edge or even hypervigilant. So think about in a school setting, if you've known kids that kind of always need to look at, they just are really quick to look at the door when the door opens, or if the teacher has to step out for a meeting, how long are you going to be gone? When are you going to be back? Who's going to cover for us? What happens next? Kids are always, always, always on edge and need to know. Partly because of that, you will see difficulties with paying attention, and you'll see difficulties with emotional regulation. Because again, the amygdala, it's the emotional center for your brain as well. So helpful to understand. Let's talk about your hippocampus. So here's a picture of your hippocampus. It's a little deeper in your brain. Kind of see it next to, kind of wrapped around your thalamus there. It comes from the Greek word for seahorse. I'm not quite sure I see it, but okay. And it's got several specific functions. The main one being that it is your brain's memory center. So it's responsible for storing memories. It's responsible for encoding from short-term to long-term memory. And as an educator, as a parent, as a therapist, as a coach, this is the part of your brain that you're targeting. Because when you're teaching anything, you want kids to remember what it is that you're teaching, right? So we are talking about learning. This is the most important part of the brain as far as learning. It's also really important in emotional processing, working in conjunction with the amygdala. And it helps us with spatial navigation. So helping us to remember how to get somewhere, how to follow directions, and that felt sense of, I know where I am when I'm there. So it's another area of the brain that is also especially sensitive to the effects of cortisol. And like the amygdala, it's sensitive to any kind of abuse at any age, but especially sexual abuse up until the age of 5. Although sometimes those effects aren't seen for years. Excess cortisol in the brain is toxic to something called seedling cells that don't mature until adolescence. But what we know is that experiences of trauma can cause the hippocampus to become smaller and less active. So you see fewer neurons, fewer synapses, and fewer dendrites, so the branching end of a neuron. What this looks like, these are some MRI images from a Yale study about hippocampal volume. Unfortunately, I don't have a comparison here, but the yellow areas that you're looking at, they reflect decreased volume in the hippocampus. Okay. So think for a minute, if the functions of the hippocampus are memory, learning, emotional processing, you can start to connect the dots in terms of what this might look like in a school, in a classroom, at home, in a therapy room, anywhere that you're encountering kids. You're going to see difficulties with learning and with memory, and difficulties encoding short-term experiences into long-term memory. And this is one of the things that can be really challenging for us as adults, because we teach things and we repeat them, and it takes a little while for things to stick. And so we have to repeat them again. And it's, hey, remember we just practiced, zipping up your jacket yesterday. What do you mean you don't remember how to do it? And you have to kind of do things again and again and again. And we'll get into it. Brains do heal. We can learn these things, but it's just a little bit more challenging for kids who may have a hippocampus that is a little bit smaller and isn't functioning optimally. We may have to do a lot of that repeating and a lot of that practice, and that can be hard. You'll also see challenges with spatial awareness. You'll see challenges with paying attention. And here's the one you're going to see a lot, is difficulty with emotional regulation. So there's a relationship between the hippocampus and the amygdala when they're functioning well that help kids to be able to manage their emotional experiences. And when you see the increased volume of the amygdala and a decreased volume in the hippocampus, you have some real challenges with being able to manage those big feelings. And again, there's things we can do about it, but this is what we want to just know when you're seeing some challenging behaviors or seeing kids who are really struggling with their emotions. This is why. This is their biology. The corpus callosum, another really important structure of your brain. This one is actually a single structure. It's right in the center of your brain. It comes from the Latin for tough body. And we're looking at it here. It's a cross section of your brain, so you can see it, just if your brain was cut in half. But if we were taking a view from above, so if you were looking from the top of your head down, this is what it would look like. So you can see it connecting the two hemispheres of your brain. Fun fact about the corpus callosum, they actually studied Einstein's brain after he died. I think it's in a jar in a museum in Philadelphia, as a matter of fact. But one of the things that they found that was really unique about Einstein's brain was that he had a gigantic corpus callosum. It was one of the things that was really different about his brain than other folks. Another fun fact about the corpus callosum is this is one of the organs in the brain where you see the most difference between gender. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But your corpus callosum has one primary function, which is that it connects the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So if we look at the different functions of the left side, this is the more logical side. Things like sequencing and linear thinking and mathematics and thinking in words and symbols, where the right side is a little bit more holistic. So imagination and arts and rhythm and expression and visualizing feelings and daydreaming. So when you think about what that means to bring them together, what is that bridge? The best way to describe it is to say that this is the place where language meets emotion. where experience is described. Okay, so experiences of trauma, like these other organs of the brain that we've been talking about, can cause problems in the development of the corpus callosum. And what you really see here are differences in size. So what does this look like? So these are scans. On the left, you see a healthy corpus callosum. It's right there. And this one on the right is a 10-year-old with PTSD related to experiences of abuse. And you can visually see the difference, that the one on the right is smaller. It doesn't look as healthy. It's not as smooth. It's a noticeable difference. The other thing that I would highlight here is that there is a structure that surrounds corpus callosum. It's called the cingulated cortex. There's actually two main portions of that, the anterior and the posterior. And that's a structure that's directly connected to the amygdala. And it's involved in the encoding of emotions, especially anger, fear, anxiety. And that structure shows some elevated activity in those who've experienced trauma. So if we think about our corpus callosum as being the bridge between language and experience, and if the corpus callosum is smaller and slower to develop, then what are the things that are going to show up in your setting? What might that look like? So this is where you're really going to see difficulties in using language to describe emotions. And this one's a tricky one for us as adults, because oftentimes when we are working with a child who's experiencing some distress, they're upset about something, that we're really good at coming to them and saying, let's take a breath, I'm here for you. And then we tend to say, use your words, right? And the problem with that is they may not be able to, especially when they're in that heightened emotional state. So to me, one of the things this points to is the importance of giving kids multiple ways to be able to express their emotions, including visual cues, feelings faces, feelings posters. I used to, when I worked in the school system, I had laminated cards on a lanyard around my neck that had feelings faces on them. And so I could be able to provide a tool to help with that emotional expression, because the ability to connect left and right, I've got emotion here, I've got language here, but I can't make these quite connect. That we can do things, we can provide tools to help support that growth. You're also going to see difficulties with integrating symbols and numbers. And the one I think about here is word problems. So as kids move up in school and, you're in math class and you've got a paragraph and it's about a train that's leaving Phoenix at I don't know what time, and there's some other train that's leaving New York and I don't know how fast it's going, but I've got a paragraph of words, then I have to be able to translate that into numbers and symbols. And you're going to see real challenges with that kind of mathematical work because of the integration of left and right hemisphere. And of course, the challenges with emotional regulation. And you'll also see some challenges with cause and effect relationships. The other thing to note is just that the gender differences, that the corpus callosum does mature faster in girls than it does in boys, and that there are unique sensitivities. For boys, the corpus callosum is particularly sensitive to neglect in infancy. And for girls, the corpus callosum sensitivity, it's sensitive to sexual abuse in any age, but especially between the ages of 9 and 10. So why do I mention those particular windows of sensitivity? Because it's when we talk about things that are predictable are preventable. And so if we know that these windows of sensitivity exist, that we as adults need to bear that in mind as we respond and support and prevent trauma. So our frontal lobes, this is right up here. It's hard for me to talk about and not touch it. It's right here, prefrontal cortex or your frontal lobes. This is the last part of your brain to mature. If you know when, just curious if anybody knows when the prefrontal cortex matures. The data typically says about age 25, though there is some science to say that it may even be later than that. For those of us who are parents of children of a certain age, this causes a little bit of angst to know this. Anybody know too how old you have to be to rent a car? It's not coincidence that car rental agencies don't rent a car to you until you're at least 25. They know the brain science. Your prefrontal cortex has some very specific and very complicated responsibilities. This is where the executive function skills are housed. So this is just a partial list of those. These are complicated tasks, things like planning and organizing, orienting ourselves to time. I'm a person who is chronically late. It is not an executive function skill that I have mastered yet. I happen to be married to somebody who has an outstanding sense of time orientation. And so when I say I'm on time, I'm, there at 12:15. He's on time at 12:05. But that's an executive function skill. Impulse control, predicting consequences, initiating tasks, completing tasks. These are all things that take a lot of neurons. It's a lot of sophisticated and challenging things to be able to learn. Important to highlight that they are executive function skills. And so anytime I use that word skills, it means it's something that can be taught. So there are things that we can do as adults to help strengthen these skills and build them. However, experiences of trauma, so that toxic stress, the high levels of cortisol, can cause problems in the development of the prefrontal cortex. So what you will see is frontal lobes that are smaller, they're less active, and maybe slower to develop. These are brain scans, they're MRIs from Yale School of Medicine. What we're looking at is the one on the left, which shows prefrontal cortex. These are actually adult brains. These are not kid brains. But the yellow shows reduced volume in the prefrontal cortex. And these are, the scans are not necessarily from trauma, but from repeated stress. These were 103 adults who took a survey called the Cumulative Adversity Interview. And these MRI scans repeatedly show the decrease in shape and volume of the prefrontal cortex for people who are experiencing lots of stress. So what does that look like? So when we think about executive function skills and how challenging they are, and if this part of our brain is smaller and less developed than it needs to be, what are you going to see in kids? So traumatized children often struggle with complex goal-directed behavior, and they have trouble adapting to environmental changes and demands. Their executive function skills lag behind those of their non-traumatized peers. So when I do trainings about adolescent brains, one of the things that I say is that it's really important for adults to be the frontal lobes for children until they are fully developed. This is much more so the case when you're working with kids who've experienced trauma. These skills can be built. That's the hopeful piece of this, but it takes a lot of support from adults and it takes a lot of repetition. So what can we do? So this is the part where we talk about strategies and things that we can do to support healing brains. And again, I'm going to say, most of you are probably doing a lot of these things already, but really important to reframe under the context of doing them because we are very specifically trying to heal from the effects of trauma. The other thing that I would highlight is that not all stress comes toxic stress. So remember, the brain responds to stress or trauma the same. It doesn't discriminate. But not all stressful or traumatic events develop into full-blown PTSD. As adults, we can be a buffer after an acute trauma in particular to prevent that toxic stress from developing. And if there has been damage from toxic stress or from chronic stress, there are very specific things that we can do to help brains heal if there has been any kind of damage from toxic stress. So I grew up in a house where I was told on the regular that whatever I was doing was going to kill my brain cells, and if I didn't stop doing it, that those brain cells were never going to grow back. So I lived in fear that, again, whatever I was doing, I was killing my brain slowly. Well, They were wrong. Mom and dad, you were wrong. What we now know and what the science has taught us is that brain cells do grow. There's a process called neurogenesis, and it's a process by which brain cells grow and they migrate to different areas of the brain. And what's really hopeful about those of us who are working with children impacted by trauma is that some of these new brain cells can migrate to areas of the brain specifically impacted by cortisol, including the hippocampus, right? Our key learning center. So this is really hopeful. There are some specific conditions that need to exist for neurogenesis, but your brain, the more that we've learned from the neuroscience, the more that we've learned is that how plastic your brain really is and how much your brain has this capacity to heal. And those were things that we didn't necessarily know beforehand. So whatever you leave with today, just make sure that that you remember that the brains heal and that that's a capacity that continues to exist throughout the lifespan. So what are the trauma-informed strategies that we can do to help promote that new brain cell growth? And again, these are things you're probably already doing a lot of, which is great. And this is not an all-inclusive list, right? There's more things that we can be doing, but these are the ones that I really want to highlight and make sure that we are really consistently implementing in our work with kids. So cultivating safety, creating routines, building relationships, allowing for individualized interventions and supports, teaching self-regulation, and practicing self-care, which may sound a little bit surprising as a trauma-informed strategy, but we will get to the why. It is really essential. So what do I mean when I say cultivate safety? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to do what we can. And I know that there are many, many scenarios where we don't always have control over what happens, especially if you're in a school and, I used to hear it a lot from teachers. I'm not sure what they're going home to. But we do what we can to ensure that no further trauma occurs. We provide reassurance. We remind children that when they are with us, that they are safe and they are loved. And a lot of the data is telling us how important it is for children to have a safe space. So there's been a lot of efforts to include safe spaces in classrooms, calming corners, anything like that. But even at home, that there is a place where a child can go if they're feeling dysregulated and they need to get themselves back online, whether that's a special chair, whether it's a tent or, something over a bed or a fort, something like that. But a place that is special to them when they are feeling dysregulated or unsafe, and they can go and know that they are safe there. There's an old TV show, Party of Five. I'm like dating myself how old I am, but it was a show about kids who had lost their parents in a car accident, and a group of siblings that the oldest one, was sort of responsible for the younger ones. And the youngest one, through the whole beginning of the show, had a tent that she set up in the living room. And so after her parents had passed away in this car accident, she set up the tent in the living room, and that was her safe space. So thinking about those in any setting. Paying attention also to tone of voice and posture. So remembering that our amygdala is not a thinking organ. So if you are using a tone of voice that may sound angry or impatient or irritated, or if a child is sitting on the floor and we are standing over them, it's not about the thinking. It is about what the amygdala is perceiving in that moment. And if the amygdala hears tone of voice or sees posture that is threatening, the amygdala is going to activate. So be aware. Again, this was one that came up in schools a lot, but talking to teachers and, we only have so much patience, right? We're human, I get it. But we need to be aware of what gets perceived when we lose our patience and when we may communicate in a way that may be perceived as threatening. And things like anti-bullying, positive culture and climate, these are efforts that are really important to continue to invest in, because these are also things that help cultivate that sense of safety. So definitely something to continue. Creating routines, our second strategy. So it's very closely tied to the first one. that routines help strengthen a sense of safety because knowing what to expect helps that amygdala to stay quiet. So at home, really important to focus on when you can, not everything is within our control, but when able, to provide consistent times for meals, bedtimes, homework, family connection, and at school, things like expectations for transitions or just knowing what the schedule is for every day. That even at home, visual cues can help because if you know what to predict, then you're not going to be on alert, right? So if I walk into a classroom and I know the first thing I do is that I know where to put my backpack and I know where my chair is and I know what I'm supposed to do until we're ready to, all the other kids get here, that I've got a routine for that. And that helps keep me regulated. The issue about deviating from the routine, we can't always maintain the routine. Life happens, right? And interestingly, at school, we would see big spikes in behavior on days where there were field trips or assemblies or things like that. It doesn't mean we should stop doing those things because the enriching activities, they're also really essential to healing from trauma. When you have to deviate from the routine, then the best thing that you can do is to prepare and to inform. Give as much information as you can give before before the field trip or before the assembly or before going to visit family or whatever it is that's going to be different. Because we need for our amygdala to know it's different, but different doesn't necessarily mean bad. And when possible, to try to incorporate familiar parts of the regular routine as best you can. If that means that we're going to read the same stories at bedtime, or we're going to bring the same snack that we always bring, or something that feels familiar and comforting. But routines are incredibly powerful for helping to heal from trauma and to help maintain and quiet that overactive amygdala. Relationships are probably the most important trauma-informed strategy. If any of you are familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, he wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I definitely recommend it. He's a psychiatrist who's done an enormous amount of work with research on childhood trauma. And he says that relationships are the agents of change and that the most powerful therapy is human love. And in the studies and data about resilience, the number one factor identified by people who have bounced back from trauma is that they had a relationship with a caring, trusted, and competent adult, not necessarily a parent, mind you. And I want to highlight that word competent, because sometimes kids have people in their lives who are consistent and they show up, but competent meaning they're able to meet the physical, emotional needs of that child. So things that are important in the quality of those relationships, again, supportive, safe, stable caregivers. When children become dysregulated, that we do this thing called co-regulation, right? That we use our nervous system, that we are calm and regulated. We are using our nervous system to help them regulate theirs. And when children become dysregulated, we use active listening. We use that calm, patient voice until they're able to regain self-control. There is a whole other day we can spend on trauma-informed strategies for parenting, for schools. The main thing I think that I would highlight, though, is that when we talk about discipline, that the root word for discipline is not to punish, it's to teach. And so to remember that when behaviors happen, it's our job to help teach the ones that we want to replace the less than desirable behaviors that we're not punishing. So in individualized interventions and support. So what do I mean by this? So this applies in schools and at home too, sometimes with siblings, that there's a kid who just kind of said, that's not fair. He got an extra snack. He got to have 5 more minutes of recess. He got to have an extra break. That's not fair. Well, the key thing to remember as we're supporting kids who've experienced trauma is that sometimes even those most challenging behaviors, even though it's counterintuitive to some degree, is that the kids who are experiencing some of those more challenging behaviors may be the ones who need need more support. And that fair isn't about everybody getting the same thing. FAIR is about everybody getting what they need in order to be successful. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And we can give kids what they need. Doesn't mean we're depriving somebody else. So just know that we can tailor the way that we intervene to kids to be able to give them what we need. It's not the same thing for everyone. Teaching self-regulation, really important. That's something we incorporate into any interaction that we have with kids. Things like teaching breathing, play feeling charades, be able to talk about where kids experience their emotions in their bodies, and practicing with them when they get upset or angry. So helping to do it with them. If you're upset, this is when we're going to breathe. Let's find an adult we can talk to. Let's go do some active play. Let's do some jumping jacks. These are things just to continue to build into every interaction with kids. And of course, making sure that we're always using that calm, neutral voice, that we're using body language that conveys safety, that we let them tell their story without interrupting, and that we're using words that help de-escalate. So always, always, always teaching, practicing, modeling self-regulation. I like this visual a lot because, again, it gives kids the ability to look at an emotion and even if they can't name it or verbalize it, they can say, yeah, that's me. That's how I feel right now. And there's strategies that are tied to each specific emotion. So, for example, if I'm sleepy or tired, I just feel kind of yuck and I don't have any energy, here's 4 things that I can do, help shift my emotional state. There's a million tools out there. Find what works for you, find what works for your kids. But there's some incredible stuff now. Thank you, Internet. Thank you, Google. You can find some great resources that work for your program and for your setting. So shifting to our final strategy is practicing self-care. And why I include this is because it is really important to acknowledge that working with traumatized kids can be extremely challenging. And it can be dysregulating to our own nervous systems. These are kids with really big behaviors, sometimes. These are kids who sometimes have challenges with learning, with relationships, with self-expression. And it's very easy for us to, like I said, get dysregulated. We have to know how to check in with ourselves when we're doing this work. Because remembering, relationships are key. That's probably the most important thing. And in those relationships, we're using co-regulation. That means we have to self-regulate, right? If we're going to co-regulate with a kid, we've got to be cool too. We need to keep it green. That's our job. And as many of us know, it's not easy being green. So when I say practicing self-care, that I'm not just talking about single events. Those are nice. It's great. Go out and get a massage or go out to dinner. Those things are good too. But what I'm talking about specifically is a discipline. It's a commitment. It's a set of practices. And I want you to be thinking about each of these domains. So how do you take care of yourself physically? How do you take care of yourself psychologically? How do you take care of your emotional health? Are you spending time with other people? Are you doing positive personal affirmations? Are you taking time to laugh? Spiritual reflection, whatever that means for you, are you taking time for? And relational self-care. So are you making time with your partner, your friends, your spouse, your kids, your pets, whoever it is that's in your life? Are you committing to that regular time? So there's several domains to be thinking about, but again, it's a commitment, right? It's a set of practices that really help us to stay balanced so we can keep doing this work. Interestingly, there's a strategy that in talking about vicarious trauma with first responders, that there was one specific strategy that first responders identified as being the most helpful for them in being able to manage that balance between work and the rest of life. And it is that they had a consistent routine to help them transition from work into home. So that's gotten a little bit more challenging for us as many of us have switched to remote work or hybrid work, that sometimes it's not as easy as just walking out of the door, walking out of the office and closing the door behind us, that work can spill over and the boundaries get a little bit harder to define. but think about what your routine is so that you've got some way of protecting that space between I've had some challenging experiences, I've been working with some challenging kids, and now it's time for me to take care of myself. So I will leave you with this important thought. We are the agents of change. And I thank all of you for doing the work that you do. And I encourage you to continue to care for yourselves and to care for each other. Whether you and I and a few others will renew the world someday remains to be seen. But within ourselves, we must renew it each day. So with that, there is, if you scan this code here, it's a link to our evaluation. I'm also going to see if I can put that in the chat. I would love to get your feedback. Really important to me to know, what works, what ways can we make better, what kind of information would you like more of? There's pieces of all of this training that, again, can be expanded on, and we can do a whole day on a lot of these different topics. So let me know what you're interested in learning more about. And of course, stay in touch. If you are interested in bringing some training to your agency, if you have questions, if you'd like to email me, we're going to make the PowerPoint available to you so you can access, if you need to come back to this after we're done today, you can do that. I do hope to stay in touch with all of you. Appreciate you all showing up today. I'm going to hang on for just a few minutes to see if there are some questions, maybe in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute, and we can talk a little bit more. But other than that, really appreciate everybody's time and attention, and thank you so much for letting me be here today.
Thank you. Getting lots of responses that this was great training, Emily. Thank you to you and for All Seasons for making today's webinar possible. Some really, really good information. Thank all of you for joining us today as well. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the presentation. The slides will be available, and also a survey asking for your feedback so that we can continually improve these webinars and bring in this information to you. Join us for our next children's webinar on April 17th at 11:30 to 12:30, hosted by the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where we will continue our discussion about the impacts of childhood trauma. The title is The Impact of Family Trauma on Infant and Early Child Development. Join us Tuesday, April 8th for the next Champion Rally, gearing up for Children's Mental Health Matters Awareness Week. Champions can brainstorm and share ideas for mental health activities to engage with children and family in their communities. If you haven't already, we invite you to sign up to be a 2025 champion. You'll be joining a growing network of Marylanders advocating for the mental well-being of children in communities across the state. We look forward to continuing to work with all of you to support families and communities across Maryland. Any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@cmhm.mhamd.org. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
This was a great session.
Thank you.